September 14, 1943. Camp Persano, southern Italy. Lieutenant Marco Castellano stood in the pre-dawn darkness outside the officers' mess tent, watching American trucks roll through the gates of what had been, until 3 days ago, an Italian military installation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The convoy stopped near the makeshift prisoner compound where 200 Italian women from the Auxiliary Corps sat huddled together, their gray uniforms still bearing the insignia of Mussolini's regime. Marco had been assigned as liaison officer, a position that felt more like punishment than duty. He had surrendered his sidearm without firing a shot when the Americans arrived, and now he was expected to facilitate the processing of his countrywomen as prisoners of war. What happened next would challenge everything he thought he understood about war, defeat, and the meaning of abundance. The American sergeant who stepped down from the lead truck was carrying 2 large cardboard boxes. Marco could smell something sweet, impossibly sweet, cutting through the September morning air thick with dust and diesel fumes. The sergeant, whose name tape read Morrison, walked directly to the compound fence and began opening the boxes. Inside were dozens of ring-shaped pastries covered in what appeared to be sugar glaze, and paper cups stacked beside large metal thermoses. Morrison looked at Marco and said in broken Italian, "Caffè, Ciambelle, per le donne, coffee, donuts, for the women." Marco's mind struggled to process what he was witnessing. These women were prisoners. They had been part of the fascist military apparatus. Many had served in anti-aircraft units, communications posts, and supply depots supporting the war effort against the Allies. Yet here was an American sergeant, offering them pastries and coffee as if they were guests at a roadside cafe rather than defeated enemies. The women stared at the food with expressions Marco would never forget, a mixture of suspicion, confusion, and desperate hunger that reflected 3 years of rationing, shortages, and the grinding deprivation of a losing war. Corporal Elena Russo was the first to approach the fence. Marco knew her slightly. She had worked in the communications center at the naval base in Taranto before the collapse. She was 24 years old, thin as a rail, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights and not enough food. She reached through the fence wire and accepted a donut from Sergeant Morrison with trembling hands. Marco watched her bring it to her nose first, inhaling the scent of sugar and fried dough as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Then she took a bite, and her eyes filled with tears. What Marco didn't understand at that moment was that he was witnessing the opening act of a systematic campaign that would fundamentally reshape Italian perceptions of American power and generosity. The donuts and coffee were not random acts of kindness, but carefully planned elements of a psychological operations strategy designed to win hearts and minds through the most basic human need, food. The U.S. Army had studied the effects of deprivation on enemy morale and had concluded that the fastest way to demonstrate American superiority was not through weapons or intimidation, but through abundance. The simple act of feeding hungry prisoners food that most Italians hadn't tasted in years would prove more effective than any propaganda leaflet or radio broadcast. The transformation of Italian prisoners from enemies to potential allies through the medium of American cuisine would demonstrate a sophistication in psychological warfare that went far beyond conventional military doctrine. It would show defeated Italians, in the most visceral way possible, that they had been fighting a nation with resources so vast it could afford to give away luxury foods to its prisoners. The battle for Italian allegiance was about to be won one donut at a time. The story of how Italy found itself in this position began on July 10, 1943, when Allied forces launched Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. Marco had been stationed at the Coastal Defense Command in Palermo when the first reports came through. The scale of the invasion fleet was beyond anything Italian intelligence had predicted. Thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of men, supported by air power that darkened the skies. The Italian coastal divisions, undermanned, poorly equipped, and demoralized by defeats in North Africa, crumbled within days. Captain Alessandro Ferretti, Marco's commanding officer, had gathered the junior officers on the evening of July 15 as Palermo prepared for inevitable capture. He spoke with the weariness of a man who had seen too much. "Gentlemen, we have been told for 3 years that we are fighting plutocratic nations grown soft and weak from luxury. Yet they come with more ships than we have trucks, more aircraft than we have artillery pieces, and their soldiers carry more personal equipment than our supply depots hold in total. Perhaps we should have questioned what we were told." By August, Sicily had fallen. The Italian government, recognizing the impossibility of continuing the war, began secret negotiations with the Allies. On September 8, the armistice of Ciambelle was announced, and Italy effectively switched sides. But the announcement created chaos rather than clarity. German forces in Italy, anticipating the betrayal, moved swiftly to disarm Italian units. Mussolini was rescued from captivity and installed as puppet leader of the Italian Social Republic in the north. Italy split into zones of control, the south under Allied occupation, the north under German control, and the center a confused battleground where nobody was quite sure who was in charge. The women of the Italian Auxiliary Corps found themselves in an impossible situation. They had joined the military to serve their country, not to fight a civil war or become pawns in a larger conflict. Many units simply dissolved as the command structure collapsed. Others, like the communications and logistics companies in the South, found themselves effectively captured when American forces arrived at their installations. They became prisoners of war by default, neither having fought nor surrendered, simply overtaken by events beyond their control. Marco had witnessed the confusion firsthand. He had been at the regional command post in Salerno when news of the armistice arrived. Within hours, German paratroopers surrounded the compound, demanding Italian forces surrender their weapons and prepare for transport to Germany as forced laborers. A brief firefight erupted, more from panic than planning, and in the chaos, Marco and about 30 others escaped into the countryside. For 3 days they hid in olive groves and abandoned farmhouses, unsure whether they were deserters, resistors, or simply lost soldiers in a war that had ended but somehow continued. When they finally encountered American forces near Persano, Marco had expected imprisonment at best, execution at worst. Instead, the Americans had seemed almost bored by their surrender. A military police captain named Hendricks had processed them with bureaucratic efficiency, confiscated their weapons, documented their names and units, and assigned them to temporary holding. "You guys are on our side now." Technically, Hendricks had explained in English that Marco barely understood, "But we gotta sort out who's who. Sit tight, don't cause trouble, and we'll figure it out." The camp at Persano had been established quickly in the grounds of a former military barracks. The Americans had separated the prisoners by gender and rank, creating distinct compounds within the larger facility. The women's compound held about 200 auxiliaries, mostly from communications, medical, and logistics units. They had been processed with the same bureaucratic efficiency as the men, but Marco noticed the American guards treated them with a courtesy that seemed at odds with their status as prisoners. Sergeant First Class Thomas Barrett, who commanded the guard detail, explained the situation to Marco on his second day as liaison officer. Barrett spoke passable Italian, learned from his grandparents who had emigrated from Naples in 1910. "Lieutenant, here's the deal. These women aren't combat soldiers. Most of them were basically doing clerical work or nursing. Washington says we treat them according to Geneva Convention, which means proper food, shelter, and medical care. But between you and me, the brass also wants them to go home and tell everyone how well the Americans treated them. It's propaganda, but it's also just decent." The food situation had been the first shock. Italian military rations by September 1943 had been reduced to subsistence levels. A typical meal consisted of a small portion of pasta or polenta, maybe some vegetables if available, and bread that was more sawdust than flour. Meat was a distant memory. Coffee had been replaced by roasted barley, or chicory. Sugar had virtually disappeared from civilian and military diets alike.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The women arriving at Camp Persano were, almost without exception, malnourished to varying degrees. The American mess sergeant, a cheerful man from Louisiana named Willie Jackson, had set up field kitchens that produced food in quantities Marco found difficult to comprehend. On the first evening, the women were served white bread, actual white bread made from wheat flour, alongside beef stew with potatoes and carrots, canned fruit and real coffee with sugar and condensed milk. Marco watched their faces as they ate, seeing disbelief give way to tears as they realized this was not a one-time gesture, but the standard daily ration. Private First Class Angela Benedetti, who had worked in the motor pool at the Foggia Air Base, later told Marco about that first meal. "I thought they were trying to fatten us up before executing us, like we were animals being prepared for slaughter. It seemed impossible that prisoners would be fed better than we had eaten as soldiers on active duty. When the guard told us this was normal, that American soldiers ate like this every day, I thought he was lying. But the next morning, they brought eggs. Actual eggs, Lieutenant. Scrambled eggs with ham and more white bread. I cried into my plate. But it was the donuts and coffee that became the symbol of American abundance, the item that represented everything the women had been denied, and everything they now associated with their captors. The donuts arrived every morning at 0600 hours, delivered by supply trucks from the main American depot in Naples. They came in wooden crates, dozens at a time, sometimes glazed, sometimes covered in sugar, sometimes filled with jam. They were accompanied by coffee, not the ersatz brews of barley and chicory that Italians had endured for years, but real American coffee, strong and bitter and wonderful, made palatable by generous amounts of sugar and canned milk. Sergeant Morrison had explained the donut operation to Marco with the enthusiasm of someone describing a military camp. "The Army figured out that morale runs on sugar and caffeine, Lieutenant. We got contracts with bakeries back in the States shipping this stuff over. Every base, every camp, every forward position gets donuts twice a week minimum. For the prisoners it's every day. Command wants them to associate America with plenty, with generosity. A guy who gets a donut every morning from his captor starts thinking maybe these captors aren't so bad." The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Corporal Maria De Luca, who had been a telephone operator in Rome before conscription, described her reaction. "Lieutenant Castellano, you must understand what these donuts meant to us. For 3 years we had been told that Americans were materialistic barbarians, that their society was decadent and weak, that they wasted resources on frivolity, while Italy embodied discipline and strength. But here we were, the disciplined ones starving in our threadbare uniforms, and here were the decadent Americans, giving us pastries every morning like it was nothing. It broke something in us, some belief we had held about the world." Marco began documenting the effects in a journal he kept, partly for his own sanity, partly because he suspected these observations might be valuable to someone someday. On September 20th, he wrote, "Watched Sergeant Morrison distribute donuts again this morning. The women no longer hesitate or show suspicion. They line up eagerly, some smiling, some trying to practice English phrases they've learned. Thank you and good morning echo through the compound. One woman, I think her name is Sophia, asked Morrison if America really had so much food that they could give it away. He laughed and said, 'Lady, we throw away more food than you've seen in a year.' She didn't believe him until he showed her the garbage detail from the American mess, mountains of waste, more food discarded in a day than our unit had for a week. She cried. The coffee ritual became equally significant. The Americans provided not just coffee, but the accessories of coffee consumption: paper cups, sugar packets in individual servings, small containers of condensed milk. The women learned to prepare their coffee the American way, loading it with sugar and milk until it was pale and sweet. They savored each cup, often making it last an hour, holding the warmth in their hands, inhaling the aroma that reminded them of peacetime cafes in Rome and Milan. Lieutenant Sophia Marchetti, who had commanded a women's auxiliary company in the anti-aircraft defense of Naples, spoke to Marco about the coffee in late September. She was 31, older than most of the women, and had maintained a dignity and bearing that commanded respect even in captivity. "Marco, may I speak freely? The coffee is poison, not literally, but psychologically. Every morning when I drink it, I remember the ersatz garbage we drank for years, the roasted acorns and grain, the bitter water we pretended was coffee. And I think about the propaganda we were told, that Americans were suffering from our blockades, that their economy was collapsing, that victory was certain. But people whose economy is collapsing don't give their prisoners real coffee with sugar. They don't waste resources on kindness. We were lied to, and the coffee proves it every single morning." The American Psychological Operations Team, working out of the headquarters in Salerno, had indeed planned this exact response. Major Richard Sullivan, a former advertising executive from Chicago, now serving as a psychological warfare officer, visited Camp Persano in early October to assess the program's effectiveness. He interviewed Marco extensively, interested in the Italian perspective on the food distribution strategy. "Lieutenant Castellano, what we're doing here is marketing, pure and simple," Sullivan explained over coffee in the officer's tent. "We're selling America, not through speeches or pamphlets, but through the most basic human experience, food. Every donut is a message that says, we have more than we need. Every cup of coffee says, we can afford to be generous. When these women go home, and they will go home soon, they'll tell their families, their neighbors, their friends. They'll say the Americans fed them better as prisoners than Mussolini fed them as soldiers. That message is worth more than a dozen propaganda broadcasts." Marco found himself troubled by this conversation. The generosity felt real. The kindness of men like Sergeant Morrison seemed genuine, yet to learn it was calculated, planned, part of a strategy, created a cognitive dissonance he struggled to resolve. Were the Americans genuinely kind people following orders to be generous, or cynical manipulators, using food as a weapon? Could it be both? The answer came in unexpected ways through small interactions that revealed the complexity of the situation. Private James Chen, a Chinese-American soldier from San Francisco, often volunteered for guard duty at the women's compound. He would practice his limited Italian with the prisoners, showing them photographs of his family, teaching them American songs. When Marco asked him why he spent his free time this way, Chen shrugged. "My parents came from China with nothing. Americans gave them a chance, treated them decent even when times were tough. These Italian ladies, they're just people caught in a bad situation. If I can make their day a little better with some conversation and donuts, why not? Orders or no orders, it's the right thing to do." This sentiment was echoed by other American soldiers. Corporal David Rosenberg, whose grandparents had fled pogroms in Russia, saw the Italian women as fellow refugees from authoritarian regimes. Sergeant Willie Jackson, whose ancestors had been enslaved, understood oppression and the importance of human dignity. The American forces at Camp Persano were themselves a diverse group, many from immigrant backgrounds, many with their own stories of hardship and survival. Their generosity toward the Italian prisoners came partly from orders, partly from propaganda strategy, but also from a genuine cultural value of helping those in need. The women began to respond not just to the food, but to this unexpected kindness. They started volunteering for work details, helping in the camp kitchens, assisting with laundry and cleaning, not because they were ordered to, but because they wanted to contribute, to be useful, to repay in some small way the decent treatment they received. A strange camaraderie, developed between captors and captives, based not on military hierarchy but on shared humanity and the universal language of food. Corporal Elena Russo, who had been the first to accept a donut that September morning, became something of an informal leader among the women. She organized language classes where the prisoners taught Italian to interested American soldiers in exchange for English lessons. She helped Sergeant Jackson in the kitchen, learning to make American dishes, fascinated by the ingredients and quantities involved. She told Marco in mid-October, "I thought I understood cooking because I helped my mother and grandmother. But Americans cook differently. Everything is measured, standardized, scaled up. Jackson showed me how they calculate rations, so many calories per man per day, so much protein, so much fat. It's scientific, industrial. Even their food is organized like a factory, and the abundance, Marco. The waste would feed a village back home." The donut operation expanded as the camp population grew. More Italian units surrendered, or were captured as the Allied advance moved north. By November, Camp Persano held over 1,000 Italian prisoners, including 500 women. The daily donut delivery increased proportionally. Marco watched the trucks arrive each morning with their cargo of pastries and coffee, a ritual that had become central to camp life. The women would gather near the fence before the trucks arrived, waiting not just for food, but for the daily affirmation that the abundance was real, ongoing, not a temporary illusion. The psychological transformation was documented by Army psychiatrists who visited the camp. Captain Abraham Feldman, a psychoanalyst from New York, interviewed dozens of the women about their experiences. His report, which Marco read years later, noted the prisoners display classic symptoms of cognitive restructuring following exposure to counter-propaganda through experiential means. Having been told for years that Americans were materialistic wastrels whose economy would collapse under the weight of war, they are now experiencing daily evidence that American material prosperity is not only real, but so vast, it extends even to enemy prisoners. The food, especially luxury items like donuts and real coffee, serves as concrete proof that everything they were told was false. The psychological impact of this realization cannot be overstated. But not everyone accepted the transformation easily. A minority of the women, particularly those from more ideologically committed fascist backgrounds, resisted the implications of American generosity. Sergeant Anna Ferraro, a committed party member who had worked in the propaganda ministry before military service, refused to eat the donuts for the first month of her captivity. She called them corruption in sugarcoating, arguing that accepting enemy food was a betrayal of Italy. She organized a small group of women who pledged to eat only the minimum necessary for survival, rejecting what they called American bribery. Marco watched this resistance movement with interest. It raised questions about the ethics of what the Americans were doing. Was it manipulation to feed hungry people well? Was it propaganda if the abundance was real? He discussed these questions with Father Giuseppe Antonelli, a military chaplain who had been captured with a hospital unit and now served the spiritual needs of the prisoners. Father Antonelli, a thoughtful man in his 50s who had served in the First World War, offered a perspective shaped by experience. "Marco, my son, I have seen how men behave when they are hungry and how they behave when they are fed. Hunger makes us animals, desperate and mean. Food restores our humanity. If the Americans feed these women well, is it manipulation or mercy? Perhaps it is both. Perhaps their motivations are mixed, as all human motivations are mixed, but the women are being fed, and that is a grace, whatever the intention behind it." The resistance movement collapsed in late November, when the Red Cross visited the camp. The international observers documented conditions, interviewed prisoners, and submitted reports confirming that Camp Persano exceeded Geneva Convention requirements for prisoner treatment. When Sergeant Ferraro was forced to admit that the Americans were following international law and treating prisoners better than required, her ideological position became untenable. She finally accepted a donut on December 3rd, and Marco watched her face as she tasted it, seeing the same mixture of surrender and relief he had seen in others. The winter of 1943–44 brought new challenges and revelations. The Allied advance stalled south of Rome at the German Gustav Line. The war that many had hoped would be over by Christmas ground into a bitter stalemate. Camp Persano became a more permanent facility, with the Americans building winterized barracks and establishing longer-term procedures. The women, who had expected quick release, realized they might be prisoners for months or even years. Yet the donuts and coffee continued every morning, through rain and cold, a constant in an uncertain world. The Americans also brought other amenities: a library with Italian books, a radio that played both American and Italian music, medical care that included dentistry and eyeglasses, even recreational facilities for sports and entertainment. The camp, which had begun as a temporary holding facility, transformed into something more complex, a demonstration project showcasing American values and capabilities. Major Sullivan returned in January 1944 with a film crew to document the camp for propaganda purposes. Marco found himself conflicted about participating but ultimately agreed to be interviewed. The resulting film, titled "Democracy Feeds Its Friends and Its Enemies," was distributed throughout liberated Italy and even dropped behind German lines. It showed the women of Camp Persano eating, working, studying, and playing sports, all while treated with dignity by their American captors. The donut distribution featured prominently, with close-ups of smiling women accepting pastries from American soldiers. Corporal Maria De Luca, watching herself on screen during a preview, began to cry. "That's not propaganda, Lieutenant. That's the truth. We really do eat like that every day. We really are treated with respect. If showing the truth is propaganda, then I don't understand what propaganda means anymore." The film's impact in Italy was significant. In areas still under German control, Italian soldiers began surrendering in larger numbers, citing the film as motivation. They wanted what the prisoners in Camp Persano had: safety, food, and a future. The Germans denounced the film as lies and Allied deception, but their denunciations lacked credibility. Everyone in Italy knew someone who had been captured by the Americans, and the stories they told matched the film's portrayal. By spring 1944, the nature of the camp had changed fundamentally. The women were no longer viewed primarily as prisoners but as potential allies and future citizens of a democratic Italy. Classes were organized teaching democratic principles, labor rights, and women's suffrage. The American officers, including female WWIIs who had arrived to help with administration, encouraged the Italian women to think of themselves not as defeated enemies but as liberated people who could help build a new Italy. Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Thompson, a WWII officer from Boston, spoke to the assembled women in April 1944 about the future. Marco translated her words, struggling with the revolutionary ideas she presented. "Ladies, in America, women vote, we own property, we work in any profession we choose. The war has shown that women can do everything men can do. When you return to Italy, you will build a new society. You can demand the same rights American women have. The donuts you eat each morning, the coffee you drink, these are symbols of the abundance democracy creates. Democracy works because it unleashes human potential, including women's potential. You have experienced American democracy as prisoners. Imagine what you could achieve as citizens of a democratic Italy." The speech electrified the camp. That evening, the women organized their first political discussion group, debating the role of women in post-war Italian society. Sergeant Anna Ferraro, the former fascist who had resisted for so long, argued passionately for women's suffrage, citing her experience in the camp as proof that women could organize work and govern themselves effectively. Marco listened in amazement as the woman who had called donuts corruption in sugar coating now used those same donuts as evidence of what a progressive society could achieve. The first group of women was released in May 1944 after the fall of Rome to Allied forces. They returned to their families carrying discharge papers, back pay in Allied military currency, and a letter from the camp commander certifying their good conduct. They also carried memories of donuts and coffee, of American soldiers who had treated them with unexpected kindness, of abundance so vast it seemed almost magical. Marco interviewed several women before their release, documenting their thoughts. Private Sofia Romano, who had been a seamstress before the war, spoke for many. "Lieutenant, when I go home, people will ask me about captivity. They will expect horror stories, but I will tell them the truth. I will tell them that the Americans fed me better as a prisoner than Mussolini fed me as a soldier. I will tell them about the donuts every morning, about Sergeant Morrison who learned my name and asked about my family, about the coffee that was always hot and always real. I will tell them that maybe we were fighting for the wrong side, because the people we called enemies treated us better than our own government ever did." The camp continued operating through the summer of 1944, gradually releasing prisoners as the Allied advance moved north and more of Italy was liberated. Each wave of releases sent more women back to their communities carrying the same message: America was not the enemy they had been told about. Americans were generous, resourceful, and fundamentally decent people who valued human dignity even in warfare. The psychological impact rippled through Italian society. In areas under Allied occupation, resistance to American presence diminished significantly. In areas still under German control, Italian cooperation with German forces decreased as soldiers and civilians alike anticipated inevitable Allied victory and wanted to be on the right side when it came. The simple act of feeding prisoners well had achieved strategic objectives that military force alone could not. By the end of 1944, Camp Persano had processed and released over 2,000 Italian prisoners, including 800 women. The operation was studied by military psychologists and became a model for prisoner treatment in future conflicts. The cost in donuts and coffee was carefully calculated, approximately $12 per prisoner per month, or about $250,000 total for the entire camp's operation. Major Sullivan, in his final report, noted that this investment had achieved propaganda effects equivalent to millions of dollars in traditional advertising and had directly contributed to Italian cooperation with Allied forces. Marco remained at the camp until its closure in February 1945. He had been offered a position in the new Italian government but declined, choosing instead to return to his home in Tuscany and resume civilian life. Before leaving, he spoke one last time with Sergeant Morrison, who had been transferred to a new posting in northern Italy. "Sergeant, I need to know something," Marco asked. "The donuts, the coffee, the kindness, was it all calculated? Was any of it real?" Morrison smiled, a tired smile from a man who had been at war for 3 years. "Lieutenant, I'm a baker from Philadelphia. Before the war, I made donuts every morning for working guys heading to the factory. I made them good because I take pride in my work. The army told me to make donuts for prisoners and I made them the same way, good because that's how I make donuts. Was it calculated? Sure. Was it real? Also sure. Both things can be true at the same time." Marco carried that answer with him for the rest of his life. In the decades after the war, as Italy rebuilt and transformed into a prosperous democracy allied with the United States, he often thought about Camp Persano and what it had represented. The Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe, the NATO alliance that protected it, the cultural exchange that followed, all of these seem to echo the same principle that America's power came not just from its weapons, but from its wealth, not just from its military but from its generosity. In 1975, 30 years after the war, Marco attended a reunion of former Camp Persano prisoners. Over 200 women came, now middle-aged, many successful in careers that would have been impossible under fascism. They shared memories of the camp, laughing about the cultural misunderstandings, the language barriers, the strange American customs they had learned. But they also spoke seriously about how the experience had changed them, how it had opened their eyes to different possibilities for how society could be organized. Elena Russo, now a successful businesswoman in Milan, stood to speak. We came to that camp as believers in an ideology that had failed us. We left as believers in something better, and it all started with donuts and coffee. The Americans understood something we didn't, that you can't build loyalty through fear and deprivation, you build it through generosity and respect. Every morning when Sergeant Morrison handed me a donut, he was showing me what America stood for. It took me years to fully understand that lesson, but I understand it now. The reunion ended with the women singing an American song they had learned in the camp, "You Are My Sunshine," in heavily accented English. Marco listened with tears in his eyes, remembering that September morning in 1943, when he had watched Elena take her first donut from Sergeant Morrison with trembling hands. That moment had seemed so small at the time, so insignificant in the context of a world war. But it had been the beginning of something larger, a transformation not just of individuals but of an entire society's understanding of what democracy could mean. The legacy of the donut operation extended far beyond Camp Persano. The principle of treating prisoners well, of demonstrating values through actions rather than words, became embedded in American military doctrine. In subsequent conflicts, from Korea to Vietnam to the Middle East, American forces would remember that how you treat prisoners reflects your values and influences outcomes. The lesson learned at Camp Persano was that abundance shared is more powerful than abundance hoarded, that generosity can be strategic without being cynical, and that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness have the largest consequences. Marco died in 2003 at the age of 85. Among his papers, his family found the journal he had kept at Camp Persano, filled with observations about donut distribution, coffee consumption, and the gradual transformation of enemy prisoners into friends and allies. They also found a photograph, creased and faded, showing a young lieutenant in an Italian uniform standing beside an American sergeant holding a box of donuts. On the back, in Marco's handwriting, was written September 1943. The day I learned that war can be won with pastries. Morrison and me at Camp Persano. We changed the world with sugar and kindness. The photograph was donated to the World War II Museum in New Orleans, where it hangs today in the exhibit on psychological warfare. Visitors often pause before it, reading the caption that explains the donut operation and its impact on the Italian theater of war. Most move on after a moment, perhaps not fully understanding the significance of what they're seeing. But occasionally, someone will stop longer, will read the journal entries displayed beside the photograph, and will begin to understand that warfare is not just about destruction but about transformation, not just about defeating enemies, but about creating friends. The women of Camp Persano carried their experience into the building of post-war Italy. They voted in the 1946 referendum that established the Italian Republic. They fought for and won women's suffrage in the new constitution. They entered professions and businesses that had been closed to them under fascism. They raised children in a democratic society and told them stories about a time when Italy had been defeated but also liberated, when American soldiers had given them donuts and coffee and with those simple gifts had shown them a different way of living. The donuts are gone now, eaten long ago. The coffee has been drunk. The men who distributed them have passed away. But the impact remains, embedded in the institutions and attitudes of modern Italy, in the alliance between former enemies, in the lesson that treating people with dignity and generosity is not just morally right, but strategically effective. The story of Italian women prisoners shocked by donuts and coffee is ultimately a story about the power of abundance, the value of kindness, and the possibility of transformation even in the darkest circumstances of war. In the end, Marco's journal entry from September 14, 1943 captures the essence of what happened. watched American sergeant distribute donuts to Italian prisoners today. The women cried as they ate, not tears of sadness but of confusion and relief. How do you process generosity from an enemy? How do you reconcile propaganda with reality? These donuts are not just food, they are messages, arguments, proof of a different way of living. I think these women will remember this morning for the rest of their lives. I think it will change them. I think somehow it will change Italy, all from donuts and coffee. War is stranger than I ever imagined. The transformation accelerated through autumn as more Italian units surrendered. Each morning, the ritual continued. Trucks arrived with wooden crates filled with glazed pastries, and the women gathered at the fence, no longer hesitant but eager. Sergeant Morrison learned their names, asked about their families, treated them like human beings rather than defeated enemies. This simple dignity proved more powerful than any weapon. Private Angela Benedetti watched American soldiers discard more food in a single day than her unit had seen in weeks. The waste itself became a message about American abundance. She realized everything she had been told about the struggling American economy was a lie. When her younger sister visited the camp in October, Angela gave her a donut to take home. The family gathered around it like a religious artifact, unable to believe prisoners ate such luxuries daily. Lieutenant Sophia Marchetti organized the women into work details, not because they were ordered to, but because the decent treatment demanded reciprocation. They helped in kitchens, learned American efficiency, absorbed democratic ideas through daily interaction. The camp became less a prison and more a training ground for citizens of a new Italy. The psychological operations team documented everything. Major Sullivan's reports showed that released prisoners became effective ambassadors, spreading stories of American generosity throughout Italy. Each woman who returned home carried memories of hot coffee and sweet pastries, of soldiers who showed respect, of a nation so wealthy it could afford kindness to its enemies. These personal testimonies convinced more Italians than any propaganda broadcast could. By spring, the camp had processed thousands of prisoners. The cost in donuts and coffee totaled $250,000, but the strategic value was incalculable. Italian resistance to Allied occupation evaporated in areas where former prisoners told their stories. German forces found fewer Italian collaborators as word spread about American treatment of captives. Sergeant Anna Ferraro, once an ideological fascist who refused the pastries for weeks, became the most vocal advocate for democracy after finally accepting a donut. Her conversion symbolized the broader transformation happening throughout Italy. The evidence was too overwhelming to deny. America's material superiority was not propaganda, but observable fact, demonstrated daily through simple acts of feeding people well. The camp closed in 1945 after processing over 2,000 prisoners. Decades later, at a reunion, the women sang American songs they had learned in captivity. They had built careers impossible under fascism, voted in free elections, raised children in a democratic society. They traced their transformation to that first morning when trembling hands accepted donuts from enemy soldiers who chose generosity over cruelty. Marco kept his journal from those days, writing on the final page that the war had been won not with bombs but with pastries, proving that abundance shared builds more lasting victories than force alone. The photograph of him and Morrison, the Italian officer and American sergeant holding a box of donuts, captured the moment when enemies became allies through the simple power of treating people with unexpected dignity and sweetness. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.